We talk about organized labor today. Of course, we're post Reconstruction at this particular point, and society is going through a tremendous amount of changes. They seem very, very, very slow, but if you go back and you look at the previous, couple thousand years, the changes that we're going through are actually compoundingly going to get more rapid. All right. So technology is the absolute best place to see how quickly things actually advance. If you look at how we went from a computer being the entirety of a room this size in order to do something very simple to now you can do those same calculations on something that fits in your pocket, plus search the internet, plus record videos, plus take pictures, plus, and that is just that level of advancement is significantly faster than what we kind of think it is in a lot of ways. All right, so anyway, the financiers and industrialists who came to dominate social, economic, and political life in post-Civil War America amassed so much wealth and showed it off so publicly that this period is often referred to as the Gilded Age. So in order to gild something, you basically cover it with a thin layer of gold, giving it the appearance of having something of greater value than what it actually warrants. The name derived from a popular novel by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, which mocked the crooked dealings of political leaders and business elite. In 1861, the United States had only a few dozen millionaires, but by 1900, there were more than 4,000 of them. Most of them were white Protestants who voted Republican. A few were women, including Madam C.J. Walker, born Sarah Breedlove, the daughter of formerly enslaved Louisianans, who created specialized hair products for African Americans. And many of these nouveau riche people became hoggishly self-indulgent. They glorified inconspicuous consumption, competing to host the fanciest of parties, living in the most extravagant houses. One tycoon gave a lavish dinner to honor his dog and presented the mutt with a $15,000 diamond necklace. All right, so at a party at New York's Delmonico's restaurant, guests smoked cigarettes wrapped in $100 bills. All right, when not attending parties, the rich were relaxing in sprawling mansions overlooking the cliffs at Newport, Rhode Island, atop Nob Hill in San Francisco, along Chicago's Lakeshore Drive, and New York City's Fifth Avenue, and down the main line in suburban Philadelphia. You got to kind of wonder what that's like, to be able to smoke $100 bills. That's got to be pretty rich to do that. Anyway, so it was left to the fast-growing middle class to practice more of the traditional virtues such as self-discipline, restraint, simplicity, and frugality. The term middle class had first appeared in the 1830s and had become more commonplace by the 1870s as more and more Americans came to view themselves as members of a distinct social class between the ragged and the rich. Most middle-class Americans working outside of the home were salaried employees of large businesses who made a new group of white-collar professionals like editors, engineers, accountants, supervisors, managers, marketers, and realtors. Others were mostly unmarried women, were secretaries, office and sales clerks, teachers, and librarians. During the 1870s, the number of office clerks quadruples and the number of accountants and bookkeepers would double. The number of attorneys, physicians, professors, journalists, nurses, teachers, and social workers also rose dramatically, although it remained a tiny percentage of the whole. The number of women working outside of the home triples between 1870 and 1900, when 5 million women, 17% of the total population, most of them unmarried, held full-time jobs. So the growing presence of middle-class women in the workforce partly reflected the increasing number of women who were gaining access to higher and higher education, as dozens of women's colleges were founded after the Civil War, and formerly all male colleges began admitting women. By 1900, about a third of the college students were women. To be sure, college women were often steered into home economics classes intended to perfect their housekeeping or social skills, but still, the doors of professions like law, medicine, science, and the arts were at least partially open to women during the Gilded Age. In this context, the woman question that created so much public discussion and controversy in the second half of the 19th century involved far more than the issue of voting rights. It concerned the liberation of at least some women from the home and from long-standing constraints on their social roles. After graduating in 1881 from Rockford College in Illinois, Jane Addams found few opportunities to use her degree and lapsed into a state of depression, during which she developed an intense desire to live in a really living world. So Adams' desire to engage in real life eventually led her to found Hull House in Chicago, one of the first of many of settlement houses, which basically helped immigrants that were coming to America, especially young immigrant women, to kind of transition and to learn of life from life itself. So she helped convince many middle-class women to enter the real world, and by 1890, Arena magazine would urge progressive-minded people to recognize the traditional view of women as homebodies for what it was, as hollow, false, and unreal. Now, many women identified with domestic life. That was the focus of numerous mass circulation magazines, the most popular of which was the Ladies' Home Journal. By 1910, it had more than 2 million subscribers, the largest circulation of any magazine in the world. The magazine provided a great clearinghouse of information to the rapidly growing urban middle class, including sections on sewing, cooking, religion, politics, and fiction. Edward Bach, the magazine's editor, didn't promote gender equality. He wanted to keep women at home, where they would maintain a high moral tone for society, believing that women in the middle class should be a steadying influence between the unrest among the lower classes and the rottenness of the upper classes. So, railroads, factories, mills, mines, slaughterhouses, and sweatshops had growing needs for unskilled workers, which attracted new groups to the workforce, especially immigrants and women and children. In addition, millions of rural folk, especially young people, formed a migratory stream from the agricultural regions of the South and the Midwest to cities and factories across the country. So the factory and mill towns were filthy places to live. The sprawling steel mill made the town of Homestead, Homestead near Pittsburgh, a case in point. The hilly streets were mostly mud holes, the tiny homes, rotting shacks, the air polluted with soot and stench. Although wages rose during the Gilded Age, there was a great disparity in the pay received by skilled and unskilled workers. So during the economic recessions and depressions that occurred about every 6 years, unskilled workers were the first to be laid off or to have their already low wages slashed. In addition, working conditions were difficult and dangerous. The average work week was about 59 hours or nearly 6 10-hour days. American industry had the highest rate of workplace accidents and deaths in the world, and there was virtually no safety or sanitation regulations. Few machines had safety devices. Few factories or mills had fire escapes. Respiratory diseases were common in mines, textile mills, and unventilated buildings. The number of accidents and deaths occurred most frequently on the railroad. Between 1888 and 1894, some 16,000 rail workers were killed and 170,000 of them maimed in on-the-job accidents. So the United States was the only industrial nation with no insurance program to cover medical expenses for on-the-job injuries. Mills, mines, factories, and local businesses needed far more unskilled workers than skilled ones. So as employers often recruited women and children for the unskilled jobs because they were willing to work for lower wages. In addition to operating sewing machines or tending to textile mill machines, spinning yard or thread, women worked as maids, cooks, or nannies. And in the manufacturing sector, women typically earned an average of $7 a week compared to the $10 a week for unskilled men. So young people had always worked in America. Farmers required everyone to pitch in. In the late 19th century, parents sent millions of children to work outside of the home. As child labor increased as parents, desperate for income, put their children to work. By 1880, 1 out of every 6 children under the age of 14 was working full-time. By 1900, the United States had almost 2 million child laborers. In Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky, boys worked in coal mines. In New England and the South, children labored in textile mills where during the night shift they had water thrown on their faces to keep them awake. In southern mills, 1/3 of the employees were under the age of 13, and children as young as 8 often worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Receiving little to no education, children, women, and immigrants created an abundant supply of workers that enabled business owners to keep wages really low. It also meant that managers and foremen viewed workers as replaceable. Factories, mills, mines, and canneries were especially dangerous places to work for children who suffered 3 times as many accidents as adult workers and higher rates of respiratory diseases. A child who worked in the Southern textile mill was only half as likely to reach the age of 20 as a child who did not. After the financial panic of 1873, the major rail lines, fearful of recession, had slashed workers' wages by 35%. By 1876, the entire economy had settled into a paralyzing depression. Railroads announced in 1877 another 10% wage cut, which led most of the railroad workers at Martinsburg, West Virginia, to walk off the job and prevent others from replacing them. Their efforts shut down rail traffic. The rail strike began to spread to hundreds of other cities and towns as tens of thousands of people walked off the job. In San Francisco, raging trainmen who blamed Asians for taking white jobs set fire to Chinese neighborhoods, and across the nation, the violence triggered by the rail strikes left more than 100 people dead, hundreds wounded, and millions of dollars in damaged property. In Pittsburgh, thousands of striking workers angered by the arrival of soldiers burned 39 buildings, destroyed more than 1,000 rail cars and locomotives. A huge crowd cheered as the Pennsylvania Railroad went up in flames. Local militiamen threw down their rifles in support of the strikers, and the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was the first nationwide labor uprising, and it revealed how polarized the relationship between the working poor and company executives had become. Governors mobilized state militia units to suppress the rioters, and in Philadelphia, the militia dispersed a crowd at the cost of 26 lives, but looting and burning continued until President Hayes dispatched federal troops to put down the insurrection. It was the first time that federal troops in large numbers had suppressed civilian strikers, and eventually the disgruntled workers, lacking organized bargaining power, had little choice but to return to work. The strike had failed, but for many it raised the possibility of what a Pittsburgh newspaper saw as a great civil war in this country between labor and capital. Many workers feeling that violence was their only option. Equally disturbing to those in power was the presence of many women amongst those protesters.
Evaluate the Gilded Age's social and economic structure by analyzing the relationship between the industrialists' conspicuous consumption and the working poor's living and working conditions. How did this disparity contribute to the rising tensions, such as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877? The Gilded Age's social and economic structure created stark contrasts between the wealthy elite and the working poor. Industrialists' extravagant spending, symbolized by lavish parties and extreme displays of wealth, highlighted their detachment from the working class, who faced long hours, dangerous working conditions, and stagnant wages. These disparities bred resentment and a sense of injustice among laborers, who saw their hardships as directly tied to the profits of the wealthy. Events like the wage cuts leading to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 reflected these tensions, as workers protested against economic exploitation, ultimately sparking violence and the intervention of state and federal troops. The strike exposed the deepening divide between labor and capital, setting the stage for future labor movements.
So in California, the National Railroad Strike indirectly gave rise to the working class political movement. In 1877, a meeting held in Lot to express sympathy for the railroad strikers ended when the white laborers attacked Chinese workers. In the so-called Sandlot incident, the 105,000 mostly male Chinese living in the far west were handy scapegoats for frustrated whites who believed that Asians had taken their jobs. Such anti-Chinese sentiment soon drove an Irish immigrant delivery man in San Francisco, Dennis Kearney, to organize the Working Men's Party of California, whose platform called for the United States to stop Chinese immigration altogether. Kearney lectured about the foreign peril and blasted railroad barons for exploiting the poor. Kearney failed to build a lasting movement, but his anti-Chinese theme became a national issue. In 1882, Congress voted to prohibit Chinese immigration for a decade. In 1869, a national labor group emerges called the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor. Even as trade unions collapsed during the Depression of the 1870s, it continued to grow rapidly. The Knights of Labor endorsed most of the reforms advanced by previous working men's groups, including the elimination of convict labor competition, 8-hour workdays, greater use of paper currency. One reform the group pursued, though, was equal pay for work by women and men. The Knights of Labor wanted to transform capitalism, as it didn't believe in organizing members according to their particular trade. It allowed as members all who had ever worked for wages, except lawyers, doctors, bankers, those who sold liquor, and the Chinese. By recruiting all types of workers, the Knights became the nation's largest labor union, but the diverse union also struggled with internal tensions. In 1879, Terence V. Powderly, the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, became the head of the Knights of Labor, stressed winning political control of the communities where union workers lived and the groups who owed its greatest growth to strikes that occurred under his leadership. In the early 1880s, the Knights increased their membership from about 100,000 to more than 700,000. So, one of the most colorful labor agitators, dressed in a matronly black dress and hat, She was a tireless champion of the working poor who had used fiery rhetoric to excite crowds and attract attention. She led marches, dodged bullets, confronted business titans and police, and served several different jail terms. In 1913, a district attorney called her the most dangerous woman in America because she labeled capitalists as cannibalistic plutocrats and pirates, and called Rockefeller the greatest murderer the nation has ever produced. Coal miners and steel workers adored her. Born in Cork, Ireland in 1837, Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, was the second of 5 children in a poor Catholic family that fled because of the Irish potato famine at mid-century and settled in Toronto before moving to Memphis, Tennessee, where she began teaching. She met and married George Jones, an iron molder and staunch Union supporter. They had 4 children, but in 1867, a yellow fever epidemic struck in Memphis, killing her husband and all of her children. The grief-stricken 37-year-old widow moved to Chicago and took up dressmaking only to see her shop, home, and belongings destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So if you're thinking, holy crap, this lady has had a terrible life, that is no joke. Literally, all her kids are dead. Her husband dies. She resettles, thinks her life is going to go okay, and then her place of work just not having a good time. Anyway, she's angry at the social inequality and injustices she saw around her. Mary Jones drifted into the labor movement and found a new family of workers, emerging as the most passionate advocate of union membership. Chicago was at the time the seabed of labor radicalism, and the union culture nurtured in her a lifelong dedication to the cause of wage workers. Declaring herself the mother of the fledgling labor movement, she joined the Knights of Labor as an organizer and public speaker. In the late 1880s, she became an ardent advocate of the United Mine Workers, then the largest union in the nation. Wherever she went, she promoted higher wages, shorter hours, safer workplaces, and restrictions on child labor. During a miners' strike in West Virginia, she was arrested, convicted of conspiracy that resulted in murder, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The public outcry against this was so much that a Senate committee was sent to investigate conditions in the mine. The governor set her free, and in 1903, Mother Jones organized a week-long march of child workers from Pennsylvania to the New York home of President Teddy Roosevelt. The children were physically stunted and mutilated, most of them missing fingers or hands from machinery or accidents. Roosevelt refused to see them, and shortly thereafter, the Pennsylvania state legislature raised the legal working age to 14. Mother Jones's commitment never wavering the entire time. One of the many challenges facing the labor movement was growing hostility from middle-class Americans who viewed unionized workers, especially those involved in clashes with police, as violent radicals or anarchists. Anarchists were the individuals that believed that powerful capitalists bribed elected officials to oppress the working poor, and they dreamed of eliminating government altogether. Some were willing to use bombs and bullets to achieve their goals. Many European anarchists, especially Germans or Italians, immigrated to the U.S. during the last quarter of the 19th century. Terrorists among them ensured that the label anarchist provoked frightening images in the minds of many Americans as they dreamed of labor unions replacing governments, enabling workers to rule. Labor-related violence increased during the 1880s as the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Between 1880 and 1900, some 6.6 million hourly workers participated in more than 23,000 strikes nationwide. Chicago was a magnet for immigrants, as especially German and Irish laborers, some of whom openly endorsed violence to ignite working class uprising. The Chicago movement's foremost demand was for the 8-hour workday. What came to be called the Haymarket Riot grew indirectly out of the prolonged agitation towards this goal. So in 1886, some 40,000 Chicago workers went on strike in support of an 8-hour workday. On May 3rd, violent clashes between strikers and non-union scabs hired to replace the striking workers erupted outside the McCormick Harvesting Machinery Company plant. The police arrived, shots rang out, and 2 strikers were killed. The killings infuriated leaders of the anarchist movement, who organized a mass protest the following night at the Haymarket Square. The rally was peaceful, but the speeches weren't, and after listening to the speakers complain about the low wages, long working hours, the crowd of angry laborers was beginning to break up, with more than 100 police officers arriving. At that point, someone threw a bomb that left dozens of people maimed and dying policemen in the street. The police then opened fire into the fleeing crowd, resulting in more casualties. 7 police officers were killed and hundreds more were wounded in what journalists called America's first terrorist bombing. The next day, Chicago's mayor banned both labor meetings and anarchist newspapers. During the summer of 1886, 7 anarchist leaders were sentenced to death despite the lack of evidence linking them to the Haymarket bomb thrower, whose identity was never determined. After being sentenced, Louis Ling declared that he was innocent, but was in favor of using force to end the abuse of the capitalist system. On November 10th, 1887, Ling committed suicide in his cell. That same day, the governor of Illinois commuted the sentences of 2 of the convicted conspirators to life imprisonment. The next day, the remaining 4 were hanged. So to labor militants around the world, the executed Haymarket anarchists became martyrs, and to the police and economic elite in Chicago, they were demonic assassins. Okay, so after the Haymarket riot, tensions between workers and management reached a fever pitch across the nation. In 1886 alone, there were 1,400 strikes involving 700,000 workers, but the violence in Chicago also triggered widespread hostility to the Knights of Labor and labor groups in general. So despite his best efforts, Union leader Terence Powderly could never separate in the public mind the Knights from the anarchists, since one of those convicted of the conspiracy and the bombing was a member of the Union. Powderly clung to the leadership until 1893, but then the Union evaporated. Yet the Knights did attain some lasting achievements, like the 1880 federal law providing for the arbitration of labor disputes and the creation of the 1884 Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics. Another one of their successes was the Foreign Act of 1885, which, though poorly enforced, penalized employers who imported immigrant workers. By their example, the Knights spread the idea of unionism and initiated a new type of organization, the Industrial Union, which included all skilled and unskilled workers within a particular industry. The craft unions, representing skilled workers, generally opposed efforts to unite with industrial unionism, fearing that doing so would mean the loss of their identity and bargaining power. Thus, in 1886, delegates from 25 craft unions organized the American Federation of Labor. It was the federation of many separate national unions of skilled workers, each of which was largely free to act on its own in dealing with business owners. Samuel Gompers served as the first president of the AFL from the founding until his death in 1924. He focused on concrete economic gains like higher wages, shorter hours, better working conditions. It grew slowly at first, but by the turn of the century, it claimed 500,000 members. In 1914, it was up to 2 million members, and in 1920, it reached its peak of about 4 million members. But even then, the AFL included less than 15% of the nation's non-agricultural workers. In fact, all unions accounted for a little more than 18% of the workers. Organized labor strongholds were in transportation and the building trades, and most of the larger manufacturing industries, including steel, textile, tobacco, and meat packing, which remained unorganized. 2 incidents in the 1890s stalled the emerging industrial union movement: the Homestead Steel Strike and the Pullman Strike. Okay. So, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, founded in 1876, was the largest craft union in the nation. As at the massive steel mill owned by Andrew Carnegie in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the union had enjoyed mostly friendly relations with management until Henry Clay Frick became the chief executive in 1889. The gruff and grim Frick was prone to explosive outrages, prided himself on being the most anti-labor executive in the nation, and a showdown was delayed ultimately until 1892, when the union contract came up for renewal. Carnegie, who had previously expressed sympathy for the unions, now wanted to destroy it so that he would no longer have to negotiate with workers over wages and working conditions. As the battle loomed, Carnegie embarked on a lengthy hunting trip to Scotland, intentionally leaving Frick to handle the difficult negotiations. Carnegie leaving, knowing what was in the works, a cost-cutting reduction in the number of highly paid skilled workers by installing labor-saving machinery, even though the corporation was enjoying very high profits. It was a deliberate attempt to smash the union. William Jones, the mill manager, opposed cutting wages, but his protest did little good. As the negotiations dragged on, Frick, knowing the union would reject the latest company offer, announced on June 25th that negotiations with the 3,800 workers would end in 4 days unless an agreement was reached. So a strike, or more properly a lockout, in which management closed the mill to try to force the union to make concessions, would begin on June 29th. Frick ordered construction of a 12-foot high fence crowned with barbed wire around the plant and equipped it with watchtowers, searchlights, rifle slits, and high-pressure water cannons. He also hired a private army of 316 Pinkerton National Detective agents to protect Fort Frick. Before dawn on July 6, 1892, the Pinkertons floated up the Monongahela River on 2 barges pulled by a tugboat. Thousands of Unionists and their families, many of them armed, were waiting on shore. 14-hour gun battle actually ensues. 7 workers and 4 Pinkertons were killed and dozens were wounded. In the end, the Pinkertons surrendered, were disarmed, and marched away to beatings and taunts from crowds lining the streets. The celebrations among workers were short-lived. A week later, the Pennsylvania governor dispatched 8,500 National Guard troops where they dispersed the picketing workers. Frick then hired strikebreakers to operate the mill. He refused to resume negotiations, and by July 18th, the tide had turned completely against the strikers. Martial law was enforced. The strike would drag on into November, but by then the Union was dead, and its leaders had been charged with murder and treason. The Union cause was not helped by Alexander Berkman, a Lithuanian anarchist who tried to assassinate Frick on July 23rd, shooting him twice in the neck and stabbing him 3 times. Despite this, Frick actually fights back fiercely and subdued the would-be assassin. All right, so some people are just too stubborn to die. Frick is one of them. Only a third of the strikers got their jobs back after agreeing to a 12-hour workday with no break periods. The names of the others were sent to the steel mills with, they were blacklisted, right? So put on a list of do not hire these individuals. So the Pullman strike involved the Pullman Palace Car Company and the American Railway Union. The catalyst for the strike was the wage cuts imposed by the Pullman Company, which manufactured the luxury rail cars while maintaining high rents in the company town where the workers lived. So in response to the wage cuts and poor working conditions, the employees went on strike in May. The ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the Pullman workers by initiating a nationwide boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. The boycott spread quickly, disrupting rail traffic across the country. Federal government, led by President Cleveland, intervened in support of the railway companies. Attorney General Richard Olney obtained a court injunction against the strike, arguing that it obstructed the delivery of mail. When the strikers refused to comply with the injunction, federal troops were called in to break the strike. The intervention led to the violence and clashes between strikers and federal forces in several locations. Ultimately, the strike was suppressed, and the leaders of the ARU, including Eugene V. Debs, was arrested. The Pullman strike highlighted the power dynamic between labor and big business, as well as the government's inclination to intervene on the side of corporate interests. So the events of the strike were also contributed to the growing labor movement and increased awareness of workers' rights.
Analyze the causes and consequences of the Haymarket riot in shaping public perceptions of labor unions and anarchism. How did this event alter the trajectory of the Knights of Labor and broader labor organizing efforts? The Haymarket riot stemmed from demands for an 8-hour workday and anarchist agitation. The violent outcome, including the bombing and subsequent deaths, provoked widespread fear of anarchism and labor unions. Public opinion shifted against labor groups, and the Knights of Labor, unfairly linked to the violence, experienced a decline in membership and influence. This event solidified fears of radicalism and stalled the momentum of industrial unions, marking a shift toward craft unionism under organizations like the AFL.
At the same time, Eugene Debs was mobilizing a socialist-based working-class movement. Militant labor leaders in the West were organizing the Western Federation of Miners, which represented hard rock miners who worked deep underground in Montana, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and the Dakotas. Almost from its birth in 1883 in Butte, Montana, the WFM was viewed as a radical labor movement, radical labor union. It was the center of the violent confrontations with mine operators who mobilized secret spies, private armies, state militias, and even federal troops against it. The several dozen miners who were killed in the clashes with management helps explain why the WFM grew especially militant. At its 1901 convention, it proclaimed that a complete revolution of social and economic conditions was the only salvation of the working class. Its leaders demanded the abolition of the wage system. By the spring of 1903, the WFM was the most militant labor organization in the country. As the group's outspoken leader, One-Eyed William Big Hill Haywood, born in Salt Lake, Utah, went to work in a Nevada silver mine at age 9. He was later a homesteader and surveyor before becoming a socialist miner and joining the union in 1896. By 1902, he was the primary spokesman. Haywood and the WFM promoted industrial unionism, recruiting both skilled and unskilled workers. They were welcoming of all races and ethnic groups, men and women. Perhaps most controversial was Haywood's advocacy of strikes over negotiations, a stance that few other unions had adopted. So, in 1905, Big Bill Haywood, Eugene Debs, Daniel De Leon, head of the Socialist Labor Party, Mother Jones, and 24 other prominent socialists and other union leaders met secretly in Chicago with a mission to give workers more political power by forming the Militant International Workers of the World, the IWW, or the Wobblies, as they were affectionately nicknamed. De Leon argued that the IWW must be founded on the right, on class struggle, rather, and the irresponsible conflict between the capitalist class and the working class. Not surprisingly, the Wobblies generated intense criticism. Haywood held the IWW together, recruiting tens of thousands of new members from the lumberyards, farms, and factories. Unlike the other unions, the Wobblies recruited members with the least power and influence, chiefly migrant workers in the West and immigrants in the East. They engaged in spectacular battles with employers that scored very few victories while arousing hysterical opposition. They were branded as anarchists, bums, and criminals, and the largest and most successful strike was against the textile mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1812. Haywood and others forged an unlikely coalition of immigrant workers speaking as many as 15 different languages, as the organizers shrewdly captured public support by portraying the strike as a plea for basic human rights. Striking mill girls carried picket signs announcing, "We want bread and roses too." The strikers won as the mill owners agreed to wage increases, overtime pay, and other benefits. And for all the stresses and strain caused by swift industrialization and labor union responses, productivity soared in the late 19th century. By 1900, the United States was producing a third of the world's goods, and millions of immigrants continued to risk it all in hopes of chasing the American dream. Corporate empires generated enormous fortunes for a few and real improvements in the quality of life for many, as the majority of workers now labored in factories and mines rather than on farms. The urban industrial revolution and the gigantic new corporations it created transformed the size, scope, and power of the American economy for good and for ill. As the 20th century dawned, an unregulated capitalist economy had grown corrupt and recklessly out of balance, and only government intervention could restore economic fairness and social stability.